Yate Abene, good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us today in this special discussion titled Every Child Matters. My name is Adam Basenti. I'm Dene. I'm the Tribal Affairs Director with the Oregon Department of Human Services. Yate She Adam Basenti Yinashe Sena Jini Nishle Sena Behli Bashishin Tabaha Datashe Toruchini Dashanella. Today's event is in direct response to the mass child grave and remains that have recently been discovered near multiple Canadian residential schools. Today, we honor the tribal children whose lives have been taken by religious and government-sponsored residential and boarding schools in Canada and the United States. We also honor those who have survived and endured the boarding school era. By elevating this issue and revealing the true impact of boarding schools on tribal nations, can we begin to heal? With us today are three distinguished Indigenous speakers who will share their perspective on what is unfolding in Canada and the United States and offer thoughts on collective healing. And before we move forward, I would like to open up with a prayer and also a song by our drum group for directions. And so if you wouldn't mind joining me in prayer first, and then I'm going to hand it over to our drum group. And feel free to pray in your own way. Shimana Hassan, Creator, thank you for bringing us into this space today. Thank you for allowing us to wake up and breathe this fresh air in this world that we live in. Thank you for all the gifts that we've received, all the blessings. Thank you for family. Thank you for the water, the food. Thank you for culture. We ask that you bless us today during this time that we address and talk about a very heavy subject, a very important topic. Ask that you just guide our words, guide our hearts and our minds in the right place so that we can come together to heal and be able to move forward in a good way. We ask that help us work together so that we can continue to serve our tribal children and families and nations in the best way we can. Our Creator, thank you again for the blessings we received, and ask that you just help us have a good day, have a good event today. Thank you. Hajana Nasli, Hajana Nasli, Hajana Nasli, Hajana Nasli. Oh, amen. Now I'm going to turn it over for 4 directions for our honor song. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for directions for our opening song. And now I want to introduce our passionate Oregon Department of Human Services Director, Fairborse Paxcheret, who has a few opening remarks. Fairborse?
Thank you, Adam, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank our tribal partners and community members for joining us today. I'm grateful to our Child Welfare Program and our Tribal Affairs Office and their directors, Rebecca Jones-Gaston and Adam Vicente, for forging such solid partnership with the common goal of improving services and outcomes for Indian children and families. And I also want to thank our ODHS staff for taking time to attend this important presentation today. There is a significant difference between history and his story. History is accurate accounting of what occurred, and his story is the attempt by conquerors and colonialists to replace history with their own version of the truth. For many years, tribal elders and organizations tried to bring attention to the issues surrounding missing or murdered American Indian and Alaska Natives adults and children. Unfortunately, it took many years for the world to begin to become aware of what has actually occurred. The recent news of the children remains found outside Canadian residential schools has sent shockwaves throughout the world and has impacted the U.S. tribal nations. This discovery has reopened wounds for First Nations people as well as the U.S. tribal nations who have experienced similar trauma in American boarding schools. I should also note that we still don't know the whole story, and there is much yet to be discovered. Today, we are honored by the presence of our distinguished tribal speakers. With deep respect, I express my appreciation to Dr. Terry Cross, Sandy Whitehawk, and Jocelyn Formsma. I'm indebted to all three of them for taking time to help us learn, reflect, and not forget. For us in Oregon Department of Human Services, today is an opportunity to honor and grieve for the First Nations children found in those mass graves and hear from our speakers on the impact of this news and how we can be of service to those deeply impacted by this tragedy. As a state agency that is in a government to government relationship with our Oregon tribes with specific responsibilities for serving our tribal population, we did not want to remain silent. Instead, we wanted to be proactive in the healing process. This will be the first of many events to support our Indigenous population and to move forward as a collective force for social justice. My appreciation to all of you again for coming together for this very important event. And with that, I'll turn it back to Adam.
Thank you, Fairborse. I appreciate your words and your presence here today, as well as your support. Now I want to introduce one of our program partners and staunch advocates, our Child Welfare Director Rebecca Jones-Gaston. Rebecca?
Good morning. It is my honor to be here and to be working with Adam and his team and with our partners here in Oregon. Thank you, Fairborse, for the acknowledgments and the words of reflection. I have lots of things that I want to share and say, but I will keep it brief in that we cannot lose the connection between the stories that we'll hear today about the experience of boarding schools and the impact it has had on tribal nations. We cannot forget the connection that child welfare has in that story. There are lots of parallels and connections to the separation of children from their families, from their tribes, as a result of our child welfare system. The exact reason why the Indian Child Welfare Act was needed, the exact reason why the Oregon Indian Child Welfare Act was needed. And I just continue to be committed to righting the wrongs and to making the work that we do on behalf of children and families absolutely in support of keeping children and families and tribes connected and supported. And so it is my honor to be here and take part in this acknowledgement, this reckoning, this healing in relation to the boarding schools, but also in recognition of the role and impact that child welfare has had on our tribal partners. So thank you, and take care.
Thank you, Rebecca, also for your words and support today. We really appreciate you. And without further ado, I want to introduce and bring to the virtual stage our first speaker today, Sandy Whitehawk. Sandy is a Sicangu Lakota and founding director of the First Nations Reparations Institute. And so, Sandy, thank you again for your presence today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Adam. And wow, you were the first person that introduced me in all these years that could say Sicangu. That was awesome. So greetings everyone out there in cyberspace. I really appreciate being here. I am in a hotel room in Bay Mills, Minnesota at another conference. So Zoom is just a gift in some ways. Huh? I know it's wore us out in many ways, but it's also been a gift that we can truly do 2 or 3 things at once. But just let me say the proper way that I was taught whenever I come before the people. Matakiapi, Chantewa Nape Chiuzapi, Sandy Whitehawk, Lakota Mia Chokatana Jiwia, Sicangu Lakota Himataha, Wablene Chabo, Wopakta Buhamani. Good day, my relatives. I come from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, and my Lakota name is Chokatana Jiwia, stands in the center woman. For those of you who know and remember our beloved elder who's now in the stars, Chris Leith, I was given my name through a ceremony that he did. So, so many times when I say that name, I think of him and think of the time and how that changed my life when I was given the name. So I forgot that I have to get set up here with a screen share so I can do my PowerPoint. So if I could get a screen share, maybe they already did and I'm just lagging because I do that. Get slideshow from the beginning. All right. My goodness, I scare myself sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to share with you today a study that we did and some other thoughts and things that I've learned throughout the years in working with adoptees. So first and foremost, I am an adoptee. I was born in '53, born on the reservation, and I was adopted when in 1955 when I was 18 months old and adopted to a white missionary couple. It was really interesting to hear throughout the years, my adoptive mom would talk about how we were called to work with the Indians. And I always could never put into words what that meant, because I don't ever recall anybody having a story that they shared with me that whatever work was going on was beneficial or healing or helpful. However, there they were. My adoption placement was very difficult. I have really wonderful memories of my adoptive father, but my adoptive mother was very abusive. And I think that she suffered from some sort of undiagnosed, untreated mental illness as well. And when I look back on the behaviors and during the years when we were stealing drugs from our parents' medicine cabinets, because that's what you do when you start doing drugs at age 15, start looking for drugs. I saw that one of her pills was lithium. So I know that she was on some pretty heavy duty mood stabilizers. But the sad part of that is I was the brunt of that abuse and no intervention. I mean, people didn't even really know what was going on. But I was really wounded by the way she would speak of me, as if she was this scruffed up puppy that she found that needed rescuing, because she used to introduce me as, "This is my adopted daughter. You should have seen where we found her. She was a wreck, a nervous wreck when we found her." That she's given to us. And she always had exceptionally negative things to say about anything being Indian. My first recall of understanding that I'm not white was when I was 6 years old. I remember she was sitting on the edge of her bed and put her shoulders on mine as I was standing in front of her. And she said, "Your mother didn't really want you. She only wanted to keep you so she could get a welfare check so she could drink." I didn't know what any of that meant. And she said it more than once throughout the years. But there's a part of me, and I think a lot of adoptees and those of us that get separated from our families, there's a part of us that doesn't believe it. Of course, we don't have any proof of that, so it's hard to believe it, but yet I hung on to that. But anyway, so this led me, like I always tell people, I didn't wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I want to work with all the adoptees, all the Native adoptees, and develop this work around it." But I was fortunate enough to address my addiction and enter recovery. But even in those years, early years of entering recovery, 7 years sober is when I first went home. And those first 7 years of sobriety, I just did it because I didn't want to drink and use drugs anymore, but I still didn't know who I was. I had no idea who I was, and was really incredibly painful emotional isolation. But I knew that my life had improved since I didn't do drugs or drink anymore, so I hung on to that. But in 1988, I was able to go home and meet my family, and that's a whole other story. But the healing began at that point. As a way to address and create like formalizing as much as we could the issues and the things that come up, I formed an organization called First Nations Repatriation Institute. I wanted to use our lived experience as told firsthand by those who've experienced child welfare to speak to those who made decisions about child welfare. I wanted people who were making decisions about permanency and all the things that you hear in child welfare. I said, well, what was the outcomes of those decisions? And I wanted them to hear and see that the majority of the people that we were encountering did not have good placements. And how is that happening? So we had to be engaged in research. We have to use our lived experiences education, and we have to really be active in our communities and encouraging healing and addressing these issues. The other point I wanted to make is the majority of families that I have encountered, our parents went to boarding school. So there's a direct link between boarding school and the families that are in child welfare today. If you ask any of them, if it wasn't their parents, it was their grandparents, and the parents had been impacted adversely by the parents' experience in boarding school. I was noticing that there were common issues within people who were adopted and fostered. They were very, you probably, if you've known anyone who grew up in foster care or someone who was adopted, especially if you meet them early on in their healing, you see that they don't have an identity. And we feel like we lost our personal power. We don't have any say over our birth records. We don't have any say over name changes. We just don't have anything that, any power, any personal power whatsoever. Even to enroll, we have to have an original birth certificate. And in most states, our original birth certificates are sealed. And it's not always easy to get it unsealed, even for the purposes of enrollment. The tribes really need to be involved in helping us access that. And sadly, one of the hardest things that I've seen is kinship relationships are altered and sometimes irreparable because the pain in the wound is so deep. No one is there helping. We don't have common knowledge of someone returning and what will happen when that individual returns. For instance, as I was meeting my uncles, my mother had already passed 2 years before I made it home. And so she was the oldest of 20. And there were she had 4 brothers right in a row underneath her. And those are the uncles who I first met, and an aunt. And they talked about when they shared what they recall about my removal. And one of my uncles said, I remember the day you were taken. The social worker drove into the driveway and scooped you up and took you. And I remember they looked down after that, and I knew what that was. I knew there was some shame there. I didn't know why. When I first went home, I didn't know anything about history, right? I just knew, wow, they feel really bad about this, and I wasn't going to pressure them. Years later, it hit me and really made me sad and angry that what it must have felt like for these men who are the protectors of our families and our communities not be able to hang on to me, a little 18-month-old baby. Had they done anything, they would have been put in jail, and I still would have been taken. So it was a hard time. And so when we come back, my uncles were strong enough and in a place in their life where they were able to move past that in their own way, because we never really talked about it much. And we maintained relationships. Sometimes that painful recall is so intense, and not understanding what it was or how to move through it. People just want to stop and cut off relationships. It is so sad when that happens. So we really need to be focused on healing. So when you look at these kinds of reactions, they're really trauma symptoms, especially that anxiety, depression, and what we find that not just adoptees have that, but everyone has that. That's been involved in boarding school and or adoption and foster care. But the main component that really is, if you were to describe it, I would say unresolved grief. Never talked about it. Historical trauma, we've really had that drilled into our heads. Here's the thing I want drilled into and I believe it. I mean, and it's good that we keep saying that, but what we need to be looking at is the part of how do we heal historical trauma? How do we go into helping our individual, our family, and our community? And basically, disenfranchised grief is there's not been a public acknowledgement, there's not been any kind of acknowledgement, and there's been no replacement to that trauma that's happened. So you've heard, many of you have lived with relatives, I'm sure, that have said they just pushed it down. I just spoke to someone when I was in South Dakota for the repatriation of our Sicangu youth, and I was talking to an elder lady, and she started talking about boarding school. She goes, yeah, we all just pushed it down. The sad part of that is, it's like if you have a beach ball and you try to if you've ever tried it, young people probably don't even know what a beach ball is. Used to be this ball that we blew up and different sizes. And for some reason as a kid, it was really fun to try to sit on it in the water or just push it down. And it would always come up all different ways. It hardly ever came straight back up. It always went sideways. Well, that's what happens with disenfranchised grief. It's not acknowledged. It's pushed down. However, it has to come out. It has to release, even if it's just in bursts. And it will come out sideways in anger, resentment, memory loss of sleep, intrusive dreams, depression, and all the symptoms that I just listed earlier. So what are the studies that have been done on adoptees? There hardly has been any. this is it right here. The one I like the most is Susan Harness right here. If you ever have the time to look up and read a study, I really appreciate hers. And most of the individuals other than Carol Locus and David Fanchel, they are not adoptees. But I want to say David Fanchel, the one in 1972, his study he did try to say that Indians should be raising their own children, but it's not a study that is helpful for adoptees because he never talked to an adoptee. He only talked to the adoptive parents. So that's not an adoptee study. But and split feather study, you may have even heard that term. I don't use that term. It's not a bad term, but we don't need a label. I don't want us to take on something other than who we are as a people. I'm Lakota. And learning what that meant is what brought healing to me. A split feather is like a definite, describes that dichotomy that an individual feels. I don't really feel Indian, I don't really feel white, and that's a real common experience. However, that's not who we are. It's an experience that we have. So there's a big difference. So I said, well, we need to do a study that's going to impact decisions made on children. And we got it out through all these different venues, but it was called Experiences of Adopted and Fostered Individuals, an Anonymous Study to Break the Silence. It's just our team of folks. We had 336 respondents and 129 said that they were First Nations individuals. And throughout this study, I used the word First Nations because Chris Leith, the man who brought me into this work, said, we were here before there was America, so we can't be Native American, we can't be American Indian. Those were names given to us. He said, we're First Nations people. We are the First Nations on this land. We had sophisticated governments, so sophisticated and ran so well, the United States government copied us. But I mean, he said, whenever you can talk about that, do that. Remind the people who we were, or who we were then and who we are now. So that's why I chose. And he'd always say, First Nations is not a tribe in Canada. It just describes all the people in Canada. So we focused on 95 of the respondents because they said they had had contact with their birth families. The majority of them were women. They had, I always say, and there's our opportunity that we were told we were going to have being an adopted person. And that's our average income. And the average age was 50 years old. But here's the outcome. 24% sexual abuse in their family, 46% physical abuse, 49% experienced emotional abuse. I think of the reasons children are taken from their parents, homelessness or being unsheltered, drugs, alcohol. And then I think of the provisions in ICWA or the statute of ICWA that says imminent harm or danger. Imminent harm or danger. Is there a meth lab? I don't think the majority of children are taken out of a lab home. I can say that because I work at the Indian Child Welfare Law Center in Minneapolis. And we see mothers lacking resources who are losing their children. And granted, there's addiction involved a lot of times, or domestic violence. But for the most part, the families that enter that law center get their children returned to them because we're able to get to the heart of what's going on. But I want you to just take this in. So in adoption, where you have a family background check, and they always say it's very thorough, but I say, is it? Have we given the parents an assessment to find out if there's a thing called a MMPI, the Minnesota Multifacial Inventory, multifacial personality inventory. And in that test, you can see traits: controlling, defensive, and different things that would really be problematic in a transracial adoption. We don't give them racial bias tests or anything. And yet we just got this thing that the state does and say, okay, this is going to be a good placement. We have no idea. And especially around the sexual abuse. The majority of people who hurt children are not caught, or they're not brought to court. They're not, so we don't know. We have no idea. And yet social workers and the whole system is set up to get these children in a permanent home. I do not hear yet to this day, other than at the law center, what can we do to get, where's the resource? How can we help? What can we do? Of course she relapsed. What do you expect? She's an addict. I hear, I still hear social workers even say, well, we're giving her chances, or we're giving him chances. He's choosing drugs over his children. Except that the heart of addiction is losing your ability to choose, and it's a shame-based disorder. And we're mistreating, we're missing the mark when we think of family preservation, if we are using those terms and descriptions. So other issues in mental health, look at here, contemplated or planned suicide, 43 of the 95. 43 of the 95. And 20 attempted. 51 say that they're in therapy for some sort of, the abuse that was cited earlier. And look at the depression number, 71%. So I don't know who on the call is an adoptee or grew up in foster care, but I can tell you, growing up and never seeing your image reflected back to you in any way, anywhere, friends, teachers, in the community, doctors, anywhere. I mean, where I grew up, that was it. Everything was white, everything. And certainly TV, movies, and even today, what do we got? Well, we finally got Rutherford Falls, but before that, all we had was Dances with Wolves, as far as having an image that we all thought was at least in a more honest image of us. But then again, the star of that story is two white people, and the Indians were the pretty backdrop. Okay, get back on the topic. So I guess here's what I want you to see and understand and know: to fight hard for family preservation, because it's a risk, and it's a high risk, that when our children are placed outside of the families and communities, incredibly high risk. So even compared to the general public, we have that higher rate of depression. Here's our citation if you want to if somebody knows how to put it in the chat, or you can, how did I do that? Or you can email me and I'll give you that so that you can read the study for yourself. When you do a Wordle from the narrative of our study, look what it's saying here: called home. So it's Sundance season for us in Rosebud, and when I started sundancing there, I realized that I had been prayed there. Wachoachage is one of the 7 rites of the pipe when we pray: the generation past, the generation present, and that generation yet to come. And so sitting in that sweat lodge the first night of purification of those 4 days before we begin dancing, I was like, wow, people didn't say, please help Nina Garnio Whitehawk. They didn't say that, but they said, for our people, we pray for the healing of our people. That was my mother, my uncles. And eventually that was a prayer for me, before I even put my feet on the earth. And that community is where I took my first toddling steps. So I was brought back, and I know I was brought back through prayer. Oh, yeah. Let me tell you a really quick story. The very first day that I was on the reservation looking for family in July of 1988, I was in the hospital, the old hospital library, the old hospital lobby. And I always read the posters and things that are on the wall. So I was going along, and this was way before you carried a phone with you to take a picture of everything you encounter, right? And but there was a Sundance flyer, and it just said where it was, and I didn't even know what a Sundance was at that point. But what it did say, it had Lakota all on the one side of it, and then English on the other side, and it said, please come and pray with us so that all our children can be returned. And I went, oh my gosh, that's me. They prayed me home. And I still didn't know entirely what that meant, but there was a part of me in my spirit that knew that I was thought of. And that's the power of our ceremonies. That's the power of our prayers. So what about our birth mothers? You know, they mirror our pain. They suffer from that disenfranchised grief, that ambiguous loss, as you were, that, you know, the kind that you can't really put your finger on. It's like a grief is there, but we always have associated grief with death. But we know that we can have grief and loss without a death. So they have the same preoccupations, anxieties, and depressions, and things that we carry. Many talked about feeling deceived, thinking that they were going to get their children back. A lot of trauma, a lot of traits of trauma. Our generation had more secrecy. So, you know, my mother's generation and my generation, I'm 68, a lot of mothers talked about the shame of being a unwed mother, all these labels that they put on women, and them wanting so badly to keep their children, but no power, no resource, no help whatsoever. And then they have to carry that with them. And just like we as adoptees always wonder, what does my mom look like? Who do I look like? They wonder the same thing on our birthdays, recalling and hoping that everything is okay, wondering if they have grandchildren, wondering so many things that no one can really help them with. But we can now. We can change that, and we can start now. So one of the things that's so frustrating is the adoption narrative is so strong. So many people are influenced by it, and we don't even realize how influenced we are. And as especially Native children, brown children have really become a commodity over the years. We are income for adoption agencies. But here's a comment. There was a study done in Minnesota some years ago on adoptees of all races. And the study showed that adoptees were 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so this comment from this Mr. Chuck Johnson, he's the National Council for Adoption, right? The president. So he really believes in adoption. But he didn't want to talk at all about the attempted suicides. He wanted to say, but the thing that really comes out at me is that it appears a vast majority of children are doing really well. Doesn't even, in just a small little acknowledgement, he says, you know, he doesn't surprise me that adopted have struggles because of the natural consequences, but it increases suicide rate, but most are doing well, so we should just move forward. I find that so insulting and so short-sighted and so telling of what his position on this is. And so this is what we're always against, or up against, I should say, having to deal with that attitude toward, we cannot speak disparagingly of any adoptive parent. I mean, I've had people when I'm just trying to share this, I've had adoptive parents say, it isn't like this, this is it. And I go, well, if it's not like that in your home, that's wonderful. So then I'm not talking to you, am I? Please just, but it's such a touchy issue. And I'm tired of it being a touchy issue. Right now, someone's contemplating whether they should stay here or leave permanently because there is no place to turn, no language to describe what's going on with them related to their adoption. Right now, a mother is needlessly losing custody of her children because she doesn't have an apartment, because she's a felon who can't get a job that pays her enough money to secure an apartment in an area, especially in an area, has to be safe and stable. And so many places are deemed not fit, but where can she go if she's not able to increase that income? Right now, across the country. I know it's happening in Minnesota. We have the highest rate of Indian child removal in the country, but I know it's happening across the country. So one of the things I want us to think about, every child, every family that's in front of any social worker, any judge, anybody at all, is connected back to boarding school in some way. And I hear us say things like, we lost our ability to parent when our youth were in boarding school. No, we didn't lose it at all. It was taken from us, intentionally driven from us through the years of torture, the years of neglect, the years of brutality. It's a miracle that we are all here today. So even those who weren't able to take care of us for whatever reason, it's a miracle. They gave us this life, the most sacred thing they could have done in their life, maybe the only time that they felt a spark of I did something. When I was a commission, I was what's it called again? Honorary witness for the TRC on residential schools in Canada. One of the things I heard over and over and over from parents was, I couldn't say I love you to my child. I couldn't hold my child. And now I know why. And being able to convey to their grown children that I suffered sexual abuse from my mother. I couldn't lay down on the bed next to my daughter when she was little. She'd say, hold me, mama. I couldn't do it. And I didn't even know why then, because I had not entered a recovery from that. There were a lot of men, a lot of fathers or men who said, I never told my wife I loved her. Could not express, but felt it. So the generation that came after them came with those injuries, not that they didn't care or love their children or their families, but the inability to share. So what do we do with that? How do we help? There's not a one-time fix, but in order to heal our brain from the traumas that happened to us, 3 simple things. There's EMDR, there's talking circles, there's therapy, there's all kinds of things that will help. But here's one, we have it built right into our culture that changes our brain chemistry, helps create those new neural pathways that develop. Because once you're abused, once you've experienced a trauma, your brain stores that information. And that's why you'll hear people say, well, like I'll say, I married someone who said the exact same things my mom said to me, because that was familiar to me. Well, how would I change that? How would I trust the change? Because in order to change that, we have to trust a process. So in light of thinking of disenfranchised grief, not publicly acknowledged, and then all of the things that we have wired in us around, trauma, secondary trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, all those things that exist from all the abuses. It's a longer story, but we now encourage tribes to welcome their relatives back who've been adopted out and their fostered individuals, and honor the birth relatives at the same time. So when we bring them out into the center and we have this acknowledgement, the wound is acknowledged, then everybody knows this has happened, but nobody has rarely come out and said, yeah, this happened. That song, those healing songs that we have are a medicine, and it does change. That changes our brain chemistry. That goes into our spirit, lowers our heart rate, and gives us that sense of well-being and movement. The three, with joy, replacing that trauma with a memory of joy. And when we hug each other, that increases oxytocin, the feel-good hormone, and it increases our social memory, so that we have a positive around that wound that happened to us. So we've been welcome. The only two tribes that have done this so far is White Earth Nation in Minnesota, and my tribe in Rosebud. That's our old flyer, but we've done it all the way up to just before COVID. Anyway, I was just making this suggestion that it would be a great way to address the wound from boarding school as well. Acknowledge our relatives, tell them that we love them. I witnessed a welcome home in Brunswick, New York, First Nations Tobic First Nations. There was a very small community, but all those who were still alive, they had an honoring for them, sang to them, fed them, and danced. And so I believe that in our culture, we already knew in our life ways, everything that we do is healing. Everything that we do has a purpose to strengthen, to nurture, to have joy. So the more we engage in those activities, the more we bring healing to our people, lifting that shame. And if anyone wants help organizing something like that, because what we do is 2 days before, sometimes just 1 day, depending on how much time you have. We have, ideally, it's nice to have 2 days. You bring all your people together and you have talking circle, you have a healing ceremony, you can have language class, stories about what is the origin of Rosebud? What does it mean to be in White Earth? What does it mean to be Anishinaabe? What does it mean to be Lakota? All those things that people need to know, and then bring them out into the center at the powwow and have that honoring and that healing. Because we know ceremonies, as I was just saying, it really does restore our innocence, that part that was taken from us. If you would have seen me before my recovery, I don't know if you'd be thinking I'd be doing what I'm doing today. I don't think so. But today, because of ceremonies, my heart's been a lot of healing, and that trusting, that nurturing, and trusting our way of life. But most of all, our people need that sense of belonging that was taken from us in boarding school, adoption, and foster care. So that is my presentation. Here's my contact information. And I have to say my website's being redone. So you're going to go to it and it'll say, it's not here, but hang in there and check within a couple of months, and hopefully we'll have our website up and running again. So again, I thank you very much for this time that you gave me here. And just remember, we didn't lose our ability to parent. We didn't lose. It was taken. That shifts everything. And we have a way to regain, reclaim, and heal. And I have to scoot really fast. I'm sorry, I can't take calls because, oh wait, is it 1 o'clock here? It is. I have to go do another presentation. So if you had any questions or comments, you can certainly email them to me or put them in the chat and someone can share the chat with me. I've just got all wordy and forgot about Q&A. So thank you. And Doksha Ke, see you again.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for your time. Yeah, really appreciate your work and your commitment over the years. Your research and how much effort you've put into this is just amazing, and we are very appreciative of your time. And sorry you have to run, but again, we just appreciate you so much and grateful that you were able to share your thoughts and insight and share the impacts again on this important topic of adoptees as well as on boarding schools. And so what we want to do now is pivot to our drum group, and who's going to provide us with a song, and then we're going to go into a short break. And so for directions, take it away. Thank you for directions. And now we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:10 a.m. Pacific. So thank you. For those joining us again right now, we want to just make sure you were notified that we are on break until 10:10 this morning, Pacific Standard Time. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, you all had a restful break. Now, I want to bring to the virtual stage a friend of mine, a colleague, and a respected individual that I really admire. And she's coming to us all the way from Ottawa, Canada. And Jocelyn Formsma is the executive director of the National Association of Friendship Centers, and she is Moos Cree First Nation. So please, everyone, welcome Jocelyn Formsma. Jocelyn?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to my friend Adam, to State of Oregon, and all of those who are joining us today. I also want to acknowledge Sandy Whitehawk and Terry Cross, two individuals that I highly respect and I've learned from over many, many years, and people that I look to when I have questions about the topics that we're exploring today. So I'm just going to put up my PowerPoint presentation. We will start there and then see where we end up. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just, I don't know if it's slow on my end or if the screen is actually just frozen. Okay. Well, that's always great when the technology doesn't work. I'm sure we're all kind of getting used to that by now, but I'll just start on my presentation anyway, and then wait for the technology to catch up to me. So I want to start with, there we go. Okay, so I just wanted to start out just some general introductions to identify basically just want to confirm.
So it looks like we may have lost Jocelyn Formsma for a second. Again, coming all the way from up north in Canada. So we're going to give her a minute or two just to see if she probably just dropped off, is going to rejoin us. And so thank you for your patience in this technical difficulty. Okay, so we made connection with Jocelyn, so she's trying to rejoin us so that she can continue presenting. And I wanted to take just the opportunity to thank those that were a part of this event that helped with the planning and really were able to bring this together. And where I would start with, of course, is our leader, Fairborse, who was a big proponent of this event, and so thank you, Fair Bourse, for being able to support us. And I also want to highlight the work of Rebecca Jones Gaston, our Child Welfare Director, as well as our Deputy Director, April Flint Gerner, who is coming to us somewhere in virtual land. And so thank you, April and Rebecca, for your partnership and for, again, being a part of this event. And, this being, of course, one of many, and a beginning to really exploring how we move forward, as an agency, and how we move forward as a collective, be able to ensure that we are taking proper steps, right, to acknowledge, recognize, but also following up with action when it comes to healing our relationships and serving our tribal nations. I also want to thank Fiona Bai, who is running our communications, and so she's behind the camera, and she's part of our child welfare communications team. And also want to thank Kristen Potts, who's a part of the Tribal Affairs Unit, who is also keeping things together and helping behind the scenes. And so, and also Melissa Sampson Greer, who is a part of the Office of Equity and Multicultural Services, and she was gracious enough to reach out to Sandy and able to ensure that we have her perspective and bring her to this event to be able to share her wonderful information. So just a couple of folks I wanted to share, get that out of the way, and just until we get Jocelyn. And so I will turn it back over to Jocelyn, who I think we now have. And so thanks again, everyone, for your patience.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I've been working on my presentation all morning, and just when it was time for me to present, it all just disappeared. So I think what I'm going to do is I'll just go through my presentation, since it seems to be working here on the phone. And then I'll do my best to try to share the slides afterwards. The good thing is I don't think I'll take up the full 45 minutes. So anytime that we've lost just as we're getting started, then I'm hopeful that I can still get through everything. As I'm going through, I may try to log back in on my computer and try to get the PowerPoint up and going, but if not, I'll just keep going through, because that is that's what we got to do sometimes. I was just mentioning, because it seemed to freeze for a little bit, and I was just mentioning that we have gotten so used to using technology during the pandemic, and yet when we need it the most, it still seems to fail us. So I can't wait for us to be able to gather again in person, and that we can have these conversations, and I can meet you all at the coffee break and at lunchtime, and all those great places that we connect with folks. So I started out by introducing myself. Wache Misawe, Shwebanish, Nishna Costume, Moos Cree Nitosjin, Maika Netotem. As mentioned, I'm from the Moos Cree First Nation, which, if you look at a map of North America, there's a big dip that goes down in the middle of Canada. My community is right at the bottom of that dip, which is James Bay, off the Hudson's Bay. And from the Mushkegowuk territory in Treaty Number 9 area, and I am from the Wolf Clan. I'm currently the executive director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. I was practicing law immediately before starting this role almost 3 years ago. And before that was working in a lot of different Indigenous organizations, and my engagement with Indigenous organizations and this work spans nearly 20 years. I'm also a board member of the National New Child Welfare Association, which many of you may be familiar with, based out of Portland, Oregon. and have worked with them for, I believe, 11 or 12 years now as sort of a board member from Canada. We do a lot of sharing of information, best practices, and that kind of thing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Friendship Center movement. Right now, we're a network of over 100 local member friendship centers and provincial territorial associations, and we exist in every region of Canada from coast to coast to coast. We were incorporated in 1972, and the concept of a friendship center, which I'm sure many can relate to, we originated in the mid-1950s. And in those times, more and more Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit were moving to urban areas from their local communities. It was sort of, I guess, at the end of the pass system where First Nations people actually literally needed to get a pass from the Indian agent to be able to leave their reserve. And then as well as like for Inuit who are coming out of the north. And it was just a self-organized network where people were just trying to meet each other very much the same way that anybody who was moving to a new city would try to find folks of like minds. You try to create a community for yourself. And certainly as Indigenous people were moving into urban settings, they sought out to find other Indigenous people to connect with, find community, and find culture. They can connect to culture. In 1972, these friendship centers came together to create the NEFC, which is a central unifying body for what we call the Friendship Center movement, and to promote and advocate the concerns of local friendship centers and provincial territorial associations. We continue that work to this day. And in September, we're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary. We also provide important urban Indigenous perspectives to federal government, general public, and our partners. We really, in the 1950s, I'll just kind of go back through as I'm going through my slides here. In the 1950s, we had the North American Indian Club in Toronto, the Koklutsa Fellowship Club in Vancouver, and the Indian Métis Friendship Center in Winnipeg. Those were sort of our founding centers. By 1968, we had 26 friendship centers across the country. By 1972, we had 43 across the country. By the 1980s, we started growing from 80 to 90. And by 2012, we had 117. To this day, there are well over 130 friendship centers across Canada. Currently, approximately 100 of those are members of the National Association of Friendship Centers. And we just brought in our most recent friendship center of this year, which is the Mammoth Friendship Center in Quebec City. Since 1972, we've actually been funded by the federal government for basic core programming. We started out as the Migrating Native Peoples program. Then we became more of a frontline service deliverer through the National Friendship Center program, which turned into the Aboriginal Friendship Center program, which became the Urban Aboriginal Strategy. And today we have the Urban Programming for Indigenous Peoples, which I think is significant because I don't think a similar type of network doesn't exist anywhere else in the world for friendship centers. And we collectively have well over 2,700 staff working in about 238 buildings, serving over 1 million people in every region in Canada in the areas of housing, childcare, health, education, employment, culture and language, family programming, economic, cultural development, and justice. So pretty proud of the network that we've built. And I think it's significant that we have been able to create such an incredible network. So yeah, as I mentioned, I will be sharing the PowerPoint with Adam and his colleagues so that you can see what I wanted to present to you. So I wanted to talk today about you have experts already in your communities at the local level, at the state level, national level, You have wonderful, amazing people that have so much knowledge and information about what do we do about the situation in the US. And I'm not going to delve into that or pretend that I have advice for anybody on the best way to go. But what I thought I'd do today is talk about the experience in Canada, and some of the aspects that we've experienced, maybe some lessons learned, and in the hopes that you maybe find some inspiration, maybe some ideas, spark some ideas of what can be done in the US, because I think we have really been able to advance the dialogue. We've been able to advance the file with respect to residential schools and the corresponding child welfare system. But we still have so much farther to go. And so that's kind of my purpose here today. So I'm just going to try to log in. I'm going to keep my phone on in case you lose me again, but I'm going to try because I really wanted to present at least the information around residential schools and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. But basically, everything Sandy Whitehawk had mentioned is so true, and it truly resonates with me. Here we go. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to mute myself on so that I can share my screen. Sorry if you're seeing me twice. And hopefully this doesn't break the internet. Okay, so basically, residential schools in Canada started in 1931. By the 1880s, the federal government had adopted official policy of funding residential schools across Canada with the explicit intent to separate children from their families and cultures. In 1920, the Indian Act, which still exists largely in the same format it is today, made attendance at residential schools mandatory for treaty status children between the ages of 7 to 15. The last residential school closed in 1996. So much like Sandy had mentioned about her experience being an adoptee, there was a whole group of survivors of the residential schools in Canada, and it was through their courage and perseverance that led to an eventual legal settlement that was reached between residential school survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit representatives, and the defendants, the federal government, and churches that were responsible for the operation of residential schools. This agreement included a public apology, which was given on June 11, 2008 by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, financial compensation to residential school survivors, including lump sum common experience payment, which I believe was around $20,000 to $40,000. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's what it was. For those students who had experienced more pain and suffering than the common experience payment, they could go through the independent assessment process. And then there was a commemoration fund that was established. This agreement also led to the development of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that for 5 years did their work, actually I think 7 years, to inform all Canadians about what happened by providing witness, opportunity for testimonies, documenting the truth of the survivors, families, communities, and developed a series of reports, and I'll go through those in a bit. I don't know why that's silly, but I'll just go through that one. Now that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work has been done, it's been done for about 5 years, all of the work transferred over to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is an amazing resource, and I highly encourage people to just go through the website. I'll kind of show you a little bit about what's there. But there's archives, records, testimony, memorials, news and events for ongoing dialogues that are currently happening, exhibits, there's items, information regarding residential school, education materials, including teaching resources, educational programs, and information about Truth and Reconciliation Week. And there's research projects and publications. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop this presentation for now, and I'm going to open up the website, because I wanted to go through those with folks just to kind of get a sense of what's there. Obviously, I'm not going to like read, word for word what had happened, but I just wanted to kind of provide you a sense of what is there. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is the summary report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The summary report is 535 pages long. But I wanted to read this first little bit to show you what we were able to achieve and acknowledge through this work. So the first line, Canada's residential school system for Aboriginal children was an education system in name only for much of its existence. These residential schools were created for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimize and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society led by Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. The schools were in existence for well over 100 years, and many successive generations of children from the same communities and families endured the experience of them. That experience was hidden for most of Canada's history until survivors of the systems were finally able to find the strength, courage, and support to bring their experiences to light. It's such a powerful, like if you think about a government document that actually acknowledges that the system was not created in the best interest of the child and to educate children, but that it was actually developed to indoctrinate children. And many people will hear the term kill the Indian in the child, which is exactly what these residential schools were created to do. And I just wanted to note this last paragraph. Getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation will be harder. It requires that the paternalistic and racist foundations of the residential school system be rejected as the basis for an ongoing relationship. Reconciliation requires a new vision based on commitment to mutual respect be developed. It also requires an understanding that the most harmful impacts of residential schools have been the loss of pride and self-respect, and the lack of respect for non-Aboriginal people have been raised to have for their Aboriginal neighbors. Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem, it's a Canadian one. Reconciliation will take time. This is significant as well because as you are embarking on your own journey, you'll come across many of the same sentiments that we experienced in Canada, which was defense of the of the residential school system. That the people who were doing it were for the best interests of the child, for positive reasons, and through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this was almost completely debunked, and it really was quite the aggressive assimilation tactic in Canada. And anybody who entertains anything otherwise is just. It sounds silly to me, and I kind of equate it to somebody telling me that Elvis is alive. Like that's how silly that it appears to me that somebody believes so strongly that if residential schools were a positive thing. I feel like they're just telling me that Elvis is alive and he's going to be coming out with a new album with Tupac, in 2 months. Like that's how ridiculous it sounds. And I'm seeing like the closed captioning come up. I'm laughing again because it is that silly. There are thousands of pages of reports, numerous chapters, including one on the missing children. But I wanted to look at the calls to action. So there were 94 calls to action, and I want to highlight. I'll go through like just the topics and the themes of each of them. But the number one calls to action was around child welfare. So we call upon the federal government
I was just making sure that the screen showed up. We call upon the federal government, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care. That's the number one call to action from the Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's hugely significant because there is quite a theme that residential schools did not stop ever, that they just turned into the child welfare system. And I think the same could be true for many experiences within the United States as well. One of the brilliant things that I believe the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did was, even though that they were provided the task to give the report back to government, they didn't stop with the federal government. They actually identified and implicated so many different institutions and organizations and pretty much anybody that had anything to do not only with the residential schools, but had a commitment or should have a commitment to doing something within their own realm to advance this work and not just let it stay there. So as we saw, first one, child welfare. Education system. There are calls to action that point at the education system and say, you need to be doing something here, including discrepancy in education funding for First Nations children educated on reserves and those being educated off reserve, as well as education systems themselves to decolonize and to provide better information around the residential schools and the place that it's had in Canadian history. Language and culture, health, the justice system, reconciliation, that there needs to be some really solid movement on policy. So adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to educate people on the Royal Proclamation and Covenant of Reconciliation, to advance work on equity for Aboriginal people in the legal system, that there be a National Council for Reconciliation to oversee the implementation of this work, that there be professional development and training for public servants, that there be apologies and reconciliation with the churches, and they're calling upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors. And for folks who know the kind of situation that occurred in residential schools, it wasn't unique to Canada and the United States. This kind of work was happening all across the world. Education for reconciliation, make a curriculum regarding education or on residential schools, youth programming, museums and archives, missing children and burial information. So you can see 5 years ago, there were calls to action regarding missing children. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which actually did come about, commemoration, media and reconciliation, business and reconciliation, sports, newcomers to Canada. So 94 calls to action within this, with everybody being implicated and saying you have a role in advancing not just where we've been, but where are we going to be going. So as you can imagine, the commission itself was one thing, but where are we now and how are we advancing with those calls to action? So this is a report card done by the Assembly of First Nations. This was done last year, just to provide an update as to where this work is. And as you can see, just quickly by looking at the calls to action, from green light to red light, and all the colors in between, yellow, slightly green, yellow, orange. I don't see, there's not too many places, if anywhere, that there is a green light. So while there has been progress on some areas, there really hasn't been significant progress across the board on all of this. So I just wanted to highlight as to, like, it's important. It was a huge feat to get those agreements and get the Truth and Reconciliation Commission But the implementation is still something that we need to be working on collectively. And as we found out about the bodies of the children at the former sites of residential schools, as the National Association of Friendship Centers, people were asking us, what do we do? How do we help? How do we, move things forward? And we turn them back to the calls to action, say, well, what have you done? And what are you going to do to make sure that these calls to action don't stay stagnant, but that you're picking up some of this work and you're advancing it within your own field? And we're, again, like, we can't say to anybody, like, you have to do this or you have to do that. What we want people to do is to look at the framework, look at the calls to action, and really, like, just see themselves in that work and pick up basically, like, my friend Karen Rastool said it this way, that when she was a child, she was trying to help her dad clean up the backyard. And so she got ready and she went outside and she's like, okay, well, what do you want me to do, Dad? And he kind of looked at her and he looked around the yard and he said, look, you can see for yourself what needs to be done. Just pick up a shovel and start doing something. And so I think it's a lesson, is that we kind of get so stuck on looking to others as to what we can do, as opposed to looking to ourselves, looking at the situation and saying, well, I have this expertise, I have this knowledge, I have this tool, I have this strength, and I believe that I can help in these ways. Is that helpful? And I think that's a lot more constructive than, again, Indigenous communities relying on less funding, less capacity to be able to coordinate the activities of what should be many, many folks. That's just my opinion. Others may have different opinions. And then we actually do have a government website that identifies their own reporting as to what they're doing with respect to advancing the calls to action. And I'll just click on one here. So this is like around child welfare. So they're reporting on, this is what we've been doing. There were historic investments for supporting the well-being of children and families, including in budget 2016, providing money for child and family services. I can't go into it today, but there is a human rights tribunal ongoing process with the government and the Assembly of First Nations and First Nations Child and Family Caring Society that basically says, for all of the funding that they've been announcing, it's still not being rolled out in a way that's equitable and accessible for all First Nations children. So yes, things are moving, but then there's also the work that we still need to do. I'm going to stop for a moment and just go back to my PowerPoint. All right. So I wanted to just bring you through the work that's happening with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Again, I don't think it's like really important for me to go through everything and explain what's in it, but it's such an amazing website to show what's there. And I hope that it will spark some possibilities for the work that's happening in the United States. So you go to nctr.ca. This is in the reports section. So you can see the reports. There's actually been one recently done on the, oh, here we go. Where are the children buried? That one's a recent one. There's a series of education resources, teaching resources. So from preschool all the way up to high school, not grade specific, adult and teacher resources on residential school history, on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then links to other educational programs, as well as Truth and Reconciliation Week. there's so this is the overall site, so you can see kind of like what's here, what's in the news. This work is very live, and it's still very resonating today. When they did the Truth and Reconciliation, as Sandy Whitehawk had mentioned, that they didn't just do it with Indigenous peoples. I mean, that was like the focus of like survivors and hearing their testimony, but they invited people to the table to hear these voices and to speak, actually not to speak, but to be ambassadors of the work. So in Canada, as a constitutional monarchy, we still have Governor General, which is the Queen's representative in Canada. So at the time, it was Michaëlle Jean. And so she was an honorary witness. Sheila Rogers is a broadcaster, a well-known broadcaster. Francisco Cali-Zay, who is now the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then there were some really key folks from different countries that were invited. So I believe John Dommett is from Australia. There were high-profile Canadians that were brought to the table to be witnesses and to hear what was happening in those testimonies from those survivors. So I think the brilliance in this, again, is like not just containing the work, but to give it away and to have other key people participate in the hearing, so that they now have to carry those stories with them and hopefully will carry them to a much broader audience. Here is an interactive map of the residential schools of where they were all across Canada. I think it's important to note that the residential schools were one thing where people, well, the children went and they stayed overnight and they were there for long periods of time, but there was even more day schools to be added to this list. And those were schools that children would go to for the day, and they experienced a lot of the same abuses in those day schools, but they still went home at the end of the day. I wanted to bring up, so as you could see, this is the breadth of the residential school system across Canada. This one in particular, if I could click on it, Bishop Horton Hall. This is actually the residential school that my mother, my aunts and uncles, and my grandmother went to. So they have information about all of the residential schools that they know about. There's photos, there's documents, there's all kinds of information here that I think is really interesting for people to kind of explore and go through. So any documents, they got them from the federal government archives, as well as from the churches. So again, just kind of sparking some ideas on things to do or places to go if this is something that the US wants to explore. Here's the residential school timeline, just to kind of give you a sense. The first one opens in 1831, Mohawk Indian Residential School, Indian Act. I think the timeline is really important to show people the breadth of the timeline, like how long these children were in schools, that they were indoctrinated, and that the culture, language, family connections, community connections were severed on purpose, and were quite deliberate, and how the government was quite deliberate. There's also a number of archives. So again, the collection on one site that's like owned and operated by Indigenous people, I think is hugely important. So you can go into the archives, and there are the witness statements, survivor and witness statements, expressions of reconciliation, materials gifted to the archives, representational, the school records that are available, documentaries that have been made on the residential schools, historical photographs, and some contemporary photographs. Just give me one moment. Go back to, how am I doing for time? Maybe if Adam can just send me a note. because the next thing I'll do is go back to the presentation and talk about Orange Shirt Day. Perfect. All I need is 10 minutes. So you'll have seen as the announcements of the findings of the children's bodies from residential schools have been coming out. There's been a call to wear orange. And I wanted to talk about where that came from and why it's important that we remember where that came from, because it actually came from a survivor. And just making sure the presentation went back up. Yes, okay. So during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, there were a number of commemoration projects and reunion events that were funded and took place. And one in particular occurred in Williams Lake, BC, at the vision of Chief Fred Robbins, who was a former student himself. So Phyllis Jack Webstat is the founder of the Orange Shirt Day, and she was a former student, a residential school student, and she told the story about how on her first day of residential school, she was wearing a shiny new orange shirt that her grandmother had bought for her, and that when she got to the school, it was actually taken away from her, and she was not allowed to wear the orange shirt. So it's a mark to the resiliency of residential school survivors, commemoration to what has happened, and really what has been taken away by the residential schools. I think it's important to also note too that a lot of folks aren't aware of the background, and that the founders of the Orange Shirt Day really wanted there to be a movement and connection to their work. So anybody who's wearing the orange t-shirts or have them made, they want to make sure that every child matters is a part of that that work. That anybody who's printing and selling the t-shirts, that the proceeds go to Orange Shirt Day or organizations and initiatives that are approved by Orange Shirt Day. So as the NEFC, we've been really happy to partner with Phyllis Webstat, and that Friendship Centers are one of the organizations or network of organizations that she has approved that Orange Shirt Day proceeds go to, because of our work in communities to reconnect, reestablish languages, cultures, connections with people in the community. And then we've also got an agreement that funds that we get from any work that we're doing, there's a portion of the proceeds that go back to the Orange Shirt Society so that they can keep doing their work. And so I just wanted to end on this piece. So I can't tell you how significant the findings of those bodies have been. There are now thousands across the country. And actually just yesterday, there was a community that was really happy to announce that they didn't find any bodies. And to them, that was the best case scenario, is that they did the search and that they found that there were no bodies on the site of that former residential school. The ripple effect has gone far and wide. I think further and wider than I even could have imagined. And it's reignited people's consciousness across Canada, across the United States, across the world, as to what has happened in our past and how those effects are still felt today. So if you imagine the last residential school closed in 1996, I was born in 1982. So that meant there's somebody from my generation that went to those schools and would be about the same age or maybe a little bit younger, that would have remembered going to those schools. This is not the distant past. This is not something that happened long ago. It is still very much within our current realities. And then in the United States, there are still a number of boarding schools that are still operating. I can't speak to those experiences. That's not what I'm here to do. I just know that they exist and that there are experts and there are people in your communities that would know better than me as to what needs to be done or the situation with those boarding schools. Our histories are complicated and layered, and what we've been finding in Canada is that people have been resisting. There's been a lot of defense of the churches, of the legacy of residential schools, people saying they were good and that people had the best of intentions in running them. There's a report from Dr. Peter Bryce that was published at the height of the residential schools. And he was actually hired by the federal government to find out why there were such high death rates in the residential schools. And he found that these schools were essentially built in a way that spread disease quite quickly, tuberculosis, like from beginning to end, there was nothing safe, health-wise or other, about these schools, and that they needed to be shut down or they needed to be significantly operated differently than the way they were. And he predicted that there would be many, many more deaths. For us, I don't like to really share the body count because I find that it's very triggering for one thing, but it's also really hard in counting the numbers to remember every single one of those lives. When you start getting up to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. If you think about every single one of those 5,000 children, who they could have been today, the families that they could have had, the lives that they could have lived, and the contributions that they could have made to our respective societies, that becomes quite overwhelming to think of what we've lost, not just in terms of those children, but what we have lost in terms of society, of thinkers and doers and people that really would have been loved and valued in our societies. One of the things that we're really trying to call for at the NAFC is that we need to create and continue to create space for grief and for understanding and for education and for truth telling. We need to find a way to hold that space and keep it sacred for the folks that need to grieve, for the people that need to learn. And at the same time, we also need to hold space to have an eye to where we're going. It floors me that Indigenous people are the fastest growing segment of the Canadian population, with over half of our population being under the age of 12, under the age of 24. I think it's way more than half. And that we have no national child well-being framework. We have no national children and youth programming specific to Indigenous children's well-being. And the funding that we do get on the work that we need to do, in my opinion, is still very reactive as opposed to proactive. So I would really just encourage us, as we're kind of going through this work together and while we're holding space for grief, that we do not lose sight of the world that we want to create for our young people in the future, and make sure that we're taking steps today to create that well-being framework and ensure that we're financially, economically, community, emotionally, spiritually investing in the children and young people today, so that we make sure that we have set them up the best way that we know how, on a strong path for the future. So I'll end it there, but thank you so much again for the opportunity to share. Sorry about the technical delays. I just appreciate the opportunity to share. There's my contact information. Again, I'll share the PowerPoint presentation. Miigwech. Back over to you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jocelyn, for your thorough and informative presentation. It's always impressive to see, Canada and leading the way in terms of reconciliation. One of the points that stuck out to me was what was in the briefs you talked about in regards to the truth. Getting to the truth is hard, but getting to reconciliation is harder. It's just moving. Thank you so much again for your time with us today and for sharing your thoughts and perspective. We do plan to share your presentation with the folks that are on with us today on YouTube, as well as those who are going to view the recording. And so thanks again, Jocelyn, for your time. We appreciate you so much. And, thank you again for all of the work that you're doing up north in Canada for the First Nations peoples and nations. And now I want to turn it over to our next Indigenous speaker, who I have had the privilege to work with and who I also deeply admire and respect. Dr. Terry Cross is coming from us from the Seneca Nation, and he is the founder and senior advisor to the National Indian Child Welfare Association out of Portland, Oregon. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Cross. Thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Adam. Thank you for asking me to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I worked with Cindy and Jocelyn for many years, and both have made such important contributions to this area. I'm going to share my screen and a few slides, and then if we have some time, we'll talk about what we do about all of this. And let's see, there we go. Get to the right spot. Are we good? And so I want to talk. I want to put all of this into a larger context. And for those of you who've seen me present before, you may have seen this slide, that what we're talking about is a much larger framework of colonialism and its approach to Indigenous populations, not just here in the US, but Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South America. For colonization to succeed in controlling the Indigenous population, you have to take the land or the territory, that they control the natural resources, particular food and water, to usurp the leadership and governance, so to take away the sovereignty, to take away the legitimacy of thought, or in other words, culture and worldview and language and spirituality and healing. And most insidious in our topic of discussion today is they have to take the children, because taking children so disrupts the social fabric of the Indigenous population that it's difficult to recover. And you have to remember that this was an intentional process. It was a process in which there, in all of those countries that I talked about, a partnership between churches and government. And it reaches far back into our history. The Virginia Company authorized kidnapping of Indian children in 1609. The Catholic Church authorized taking Indian children to save and civilize them in the 1700s. And the U.S. established the Civilization Fund in 1819, giving grants to churches to establish missions and boarding schools throughout Indian country. I call this the first faith-based initiative. The U.S. established the federal boarding schools in the 1870s with the official policy of kill the Indian, save the man. And it's continuing, it continues. The BIA established the ARENA project in 1952 and beyond. This was the transracial adoption program in which BIA and Child Welfare League not only conducted transracial adoptions, but taught their member agencies to remove Indian children, not because they were abused or neglected, but to save and socialize them into the mainstream. Today, we see that continuing as the disproportionality in foster care. You see my chart here, how that disproportionality operates. So of 200 reported cases for white children, 50 of those will be investigated. The rest will be screened out. 25 will be substantiated and 8 placed. For American Indian and Alaska Native children, of 200 cases reported, 100 will be investigated, 50 will be substantiated, and 32 placed. And there's no explanation for this phenomenon except racial bias. And what the beliefs are ingrained in our society based on this historic relationship of colonialism and the legacy of the boarding school era and its impact on our families. So today across the country, and generally our Native children are over two times more likely to be placed in foster care. But this is a misleading figure because it ranges from this 2.1 figure all the way to 12 times more likely to be placed. Now, if a family has a substance use disorder, their child, an American Indian child, is 8 times more likely to be placed in foster care than a white family that has a substance use disorder. Again, tracing directly back to the cultural beliefs in a colonial society about the value of the indigenous population and how they should be treated. This post-colonial historic trauma that is created by these policies of colonialism, particularly boarding schools, led to the intergenerational trauma and the lateral oppression of violence, internalized racism, shame and fear and guilt, and identity issues. One of the things I want to point out is how damaging these policies were to social norms. So we know, because of research in the 1970s, before the Indian Child Welfare Act, that 1 in every 4 Indian children was in out-of-home care, 85 to 95% of them in non-Indian homes and institutions. And we also know that there were American Indian communities where there were literally no children. And what happens in communities where there are no children? Well, the social norms begin to go sideways. The damage that's done, and Sandy spoke of this earlier this morning, we think of what is the traumatic impact on the child who's taken, whether it's to boarding school or unnecessary removal to foster care because of poverty and other issues. For every child that's removed, a large network of caregivers have broken hearts and a legacy of loss and grief and trauma. And so what happens in our communities is a cycle of adverse childhood experiences, but we don't blame the system, we blame the victims. And we see that in operation today, because today we have disparities in every area. We see this disproportionality and it's shrugged off as a problem of the community. We see poor outcomes for our children and families, and they're accepted. And we see barriers in funding when people are trying to solve problems in their communities, and barriers in self-determination and funding. These are complex issues. There's chronic trauma reinforced by systems that are not well suited to fix the problems. So the impact of this historical trauma that you've heard about today with the boarding school is a cycle. Sandy said it well. People didn't lose their parenting. They were taken, but they were damaged intentionally. Our children who were taken were victims of abuse and loss and trauma. But the parents and the caregivers have been victims of abuse and loss and trauma. These are both personal family traumas as well as collective traumas. So this wholesale removal of children has led to a collective trauma, leading to a continuation of adverse childhood experiences, then reinforcing the loss and the victimization. We see the damaged attachments, the insecure attachments, the mental health issues, and the substance abuse issues that then perpetuate the cycle of historic trauma for the next generation. And you can look back at how long this has happened systematically in the United States since the early 1800s, so that 7 generations or more have experienced this cycle of loss. I do a lot of training in child welfare. And in a training event several years ago, a caseworker said to me, as I was talking about this history, "Why don't you get over it?" I said, "We'll get over it when you stop it." It's difficult for our communities to heal when the trauma continues to be perpetuated through a child welfare system that attacks the family as if it's the reason for the problem. Because overrepresentation in child welfare can be traced primarily to poverty, poor housing, poor education, untreated mental health issues, and caregiver substance misuse. And just like in past generations, where the colonial society feels like it can do better by removing children, it is actually doing damage in the same damage that has historically been done in the boarding school era. So is this system a setup for failure? Are these problems that I just talked about, the housing, the untreated mental health problems, are they problems that families can solve that by themselves? I don't want to diminish in any way that people have responsibility to own what hurts and try to make it better. But these problems are so large that families, by and large, are unable to solve them, and yet they're given a list of conditions that they need to meet to have their children remain in their homes or be returned to their homes. The basic principles of child welfare in the United States is a system of rescue and policing control of parental behavior. It assumes that families have the tools that they need to ensure the safety and well-being of the children. And it places safety at the paramount, at the most important height of a decision-making process. And when a family can't ensure that safety, the state or county steps in to try to ensure that. It assumes that the system is a better parent. Families then must engage the system to change. In other words, it's the onus is put on this family to meet the list of conditions that the system puts on it. And the family has to reach out and do the work. The child is usually removed, assuming that the system is the better parent. Now, the child welfare system then doesn't address the main causes. It doesn't address the poverty issues or the housing issues or the mental health issues, the loss and trauma that's historically ingrained in the society, and it doesn't address the issues of substance abuse that are the symptoms of this historic cycle of loss and poverty. Theda Newbreast says, colonization dismembered our culture, our people, and our families. Our job is remembering, and the double entendre is intentional, putting ourselves back together literally by remembering our culture, strengthening our parenting, recovering from this trauma by understanding what happened to us and what our culture is about and how it teaches us how to heal and how to raise children. I want to mention, and I think Jocelyn mentioned this, in 2005, the Child and Family Caring Society in Canada and NICWA and the Child Welfare League of America and the Child Welfare League of Canada came together in a process of truth healing and reconciliation to discuss how could the child welfare system be changed to promote healing and stop this cycle of unnecessary removals and putting the onus on families to heal something that's far beyond our capacity, from the capacity of most families to heal by themselves. The result of that 5-day truth and healing and reconciliation process was something we call the touchstones of hope. And these are 5 principles to guide the development of child welfare services that recognize this history and allow us to move forward. You can find, if you just go online and Google Touchstones of Hope, you will find the document that came out of it. The principles are self-determination. We have to decide in our own communities what works, how to heal. We have to own what hurts and be able to address those issues. And culture and language, the second principle, as is at the heart of being able to treat that trauma and be able to move forward. This is the remembering that Theda talked about. We need holistic approaches. We need to treat the whole person. We have to have structural interventions. In other words, we have to deal with the housing issues, with the poverty issues, with the justice issues. So we can't just intervene and say that's somebody else's job. We have to help families be able to get the services that they need. And that has to be non-discriminatory. We have to fund tribal child welfare services at the same level that the states and counties are funded, and probably more because of what happened and what was intentionally done. The federal government should be funding child welfare at a level that recognizes how to repair the damage that they've done in the past. We hope that this is an outcome of the secretary's look at this issue in the current environment. These touchstones, we also call them our relational worldview model. It says that the system needs to engage the families. The tribes step in when families fail to protect, but they don't have to remove children. They have to put in the protections and the strengths in the family, and it assumes that the family, including the extended family, with support, with guidance, and with careful attention to safety, is the better parent. You see, culture matters. Colonization decolonization is healing. Colonization, this is something that happened to us. The impacts are profound, they're complex, they're intergenerational, and the trauma continues through the generations if we don't heal it. There's nothing wrong with us as Indigenous people. We are vital human beings to whom terrible things have happened. And trauma can be healed, and we know how to heal. Our cultures have taught us how to heal. But it's hard to do that healing when the cycle of trauma is continuing to be perpetuated through the unnecessary removal of children. And we see these events in the world around us as more and more of past generations of children are discovered. These can take us into a place of trauma that is triggered, and it continues this process of perpetuating these losses when there isn't appropriate responses to support the healing and well-being of people. I want to talk a little more about that. I want to say that our cultures, I'm a citizen of the Seneca Nation of India. Senecas are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacies. Most of you will know that as the Iroquois Confederacy. Our own traditional name for ourselves is the Haudenosaunee. This character that you see here is Wahayenta, a no-face doll. We have legends. She teaches us how to live, but she also teaches us how to survive hardship. The black and white necklace that she wears is a necklace that was given to her in ceremony to help her remember that in her life and in her journey, good things happen and difficult things happen. There are those things that will help her and those things that will hinder her. And she will survive and she will be stronger because there are those who will help and there are those when troubling times come. So it is important in our cultures for us to know, to have our healing ways and to be able to be strong in who we are. But the cycle of trauma has to be interrupted. I talked to an elder in British Columbia in about May of 2019 at an elders conference, and we were talking about her experience in understanding what happened to her in residential school. And we were talking about, she had attended several workshops in her community on trauma. And she was so pleased with having been able to talk about what happened to her in boarding school. And then she leaned over the table and she said, you know, I had so much pain in my heart that it would swell up my throat and pour out my mouth in ugly words. I hurt my family. I hurt my children because what happened to me. Now I'm working on to heal my trauma from residential school and the relationships that I damaged because of what happened to me. Wow. What a powerful message that was. How it packs in to what we need to know and do in order to heal this legacy of residential schools. We are going to continue to hear more and more and more about the numbers of children who died in boarding schools. Imagine, if you do the math, this started in the 1820s. So more than almost 200 years, we still have boarding schools. And at the height of schools, there were 500 schools in the United States. Imagine whether marked graves or unmarked graves, how many children never made it home. Try the math. We are going to see much more of this. The legacy of those losses, I hope, bring us back to what our task is today. Our task is to heal ourselves from the legacy of what happened. And this elder gives us directions. We have to recognize when that pain swells up in our hearts so much that it pours out our mouths and has ugly words, and the damage that we can do generation to generation because of what happened to us. It's how historical traumas work. So grandmas matter in all of this. The love of grandmas, of elders, of grandpas, the things that we know are taught in our culture that heal. Culture heals, hope heals, safety heals, gratitude, respect, laughter, medicines, truth. And I say medicines, I mean our traditional medicines, our plants, our sacred places. The truth heals. We have to be able to tell the truth and hear the truth from others. Service to others heal. Tears heal. The stories, our stories heal. Being honest, being giving of ourselves, generosity to others, relying on our spirituality and our spiritual teachings, having courage, having wisdom to proceed, having meaningful work, and loving one another. These are all things that we're taught in our different indigenous cultures that help heal us and bring us back into balance. Recently, I had the opportunity to hear a First Nations therapist. We were talking about the finding of the unmarked graves. And she shared that she used to resent her mother for not being nurturing. She always felt that it was something wrong with her. But when the news came about the unmarked graves, her mother told her about the abuse that she experienced and witnessed in residential school. And suddenly she realized that she didn't need to forgive her mother, that it wasn't her mother's fault for not being nurturing. Instead, she said, "Thank you for surviving." And in those words, they experienced healing. I can't emphasize enough how much we need to take these opportunities when we hear of the hard things to be able to speak the truth and find the words and the healing in our relationships so we can interrupt that cycle of that historical trauma. See, love matters. How we relate to one another, how we learn, and how we remember and we put ourselves back together. These are the things that our communities are working on. And we need help from the non-native world. We need people to be allies. And one of the main ways that you can be allies is by helping us self-determine, to be partners in healing, not in perpetuating the traumas and the types of approaches that have been done in the past. I don't in any way want to diminish that we have to address the issues of child abuse and neglect in our communities, but we place far too many children unnecessarily because of cultural biases that are built into this colonial history. We can do it differently. We need to go beyond interpersonal dialogues like this session. We need to assume responsibility for building bridges and net within our networks, being able to help in building the systems that will respond to families. We need to build out the tools to further our reconciliation agenda and create spaces where we can work together. And I think committing to the principles of the touchstones that I shared with you earlier, these are important steps. This is my contact information. And this is a picture of my mother and my grandson. My mother passed away now 2 years ago. And this is, these are two of my best teachers. To be able to have generations intact, to be able to hear the truth of my mother's experience before she passed away, and now to pass that on to my grandson so that he can grow strong and be proud of his cultural heritage. These are the things that help us recover from this legacy of child removals that are intentionally created to de-Indianize the Indian. I appreciate the time today, and I'm going to stop sharing this. And Adam, if you want to jump in there, I don't know what you have planned for questions or.
You're going to go live. Thank you so much, Dr. Cross. Really appreciate everything you put forward in your presentation. The points are spot on and really what we need to hear for today. The next steps, those are some things that we are all thinking about and what we can do to move forward. And so I appreciate your guidance, your vision. I know you've been doing this work for a long time. And so for today, I think what we want to do is save our questions, but probably at our next event, really open it up and have more of an open dialogue. I just again thank you, Dr. Cross, for your time today, and thank you again for all that you have done and are continuing to do for Indian country and our First Nations in Canada.
Thank you.
Now I want to bring to our virtual stage one of our final speakers for today is going to provide some closing remarks, and that is our very own Child Welfare Director, Rebecca Jones-Gaston, who I've had the pleasure to work and partner with, and really enjoy her energy and the guidance vision as well in this work that we do at the agency. And so I want to turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, Terry, Jocelyn, and Sandy. Every time I have the privilege of hearing you present and share, I learn something more and continue to have my commitment renewed and energized in the work that I have the opportunity to lead. And so we've heard a number of things. We've heard examples of the profound trauma and impact that has been experienced by tribal nations across the world, around the world, and here in the US. We've heard about the possibilities and the work that it takes to actually move towards healing and reconciliation, and that it is possible. And I think, the other thing that I've heard is really responsibility of the systems to play a role in acknowledging the impact that has been experienced and has happened to our tribal nations. And I'm reflecting on just thinking about all of what's been shared and my ongoing learning around the parallels that exist. And what you heard in Dr. Cross's presentation, the intentionality of what has existed within the child welfare system of perpetuating this separation of children from their tribes and their families. And just think about the work that we do across Oregon with impacting children and families in tribal nations, impacting children and families in other cultures, other communities, and we have to do something different. I've said it before. The child welfare system, as it is structured, is not the system that we necessarily want to take with us into the future and what we want to build towards. And so we have our vision for transformation that talks about family and child well-being and community well-being. And that means we've got to do our work differently and move out of the space of punishment, consequence, and be partners in what we do with the communities that we're serving. And I'm pausing and hesitating because it's so profound, the impact that has happened and the generational impact. So Dr. Cross shared his teachers, his mother, and his grandchildren. And we've got opportunities to do something different. I know that, across our work here in Oregon, it's what we're trying to do. We're really trying to build forward and really dismantle a system that isn't working for all of the communities that it's impacting and build something in its place. And I think some critical things for us to think about is fulfilling our obligations to the Indian Child Welfare Act and the Oregon Indian Child Welfare Act. First and foremost, it is how do we engage with communities that we're serving? How do we work to strive to help children safely stay with their families and within their communities to the best of our ability? And that will take some investment. But it also, going back to those 5 touchstones of hope, I'm going to hold on to that. The self-determination, we don't have all of the answers. How are we opening ourselves up to really engaging with those that we're serving to make a plan for how do we work together for communities, families, children to have what they need based on what they feel that they need. Culture and language is such a critical part of who each of us are. And we've got an obligation in our role in child welfare to help maintain that, to help grow it, to help keep it strong and keep children connected to it. And I'll be clear, it's not easy and it won't be easy. We have centuries of impact that has occurred. And I really believe that the time is now for us to do something different and to take on our responsibility and do the best that we can and really try to do things differently as we're working with families and children who are experiencing some of the most challenging circumstances that they may in their life. And children being such a critical part of a community, of a tribal nation, of a family, and having our role be, how do we help strengthen that? How do we support the well-being and wellness of the communities that we serve. And so I would just, I think, kind of ask each of you to think about what can you do individually in your work day to day to really try and move us towards our own healing process from the child welfare system and what we're doing, and then join me and your colleagues and our partners across the state and across the country to figure out what it is that we need to do to have our system be a system that is supporting communities, supporting families, supporting children, and really helping communities and families thrive without having to experience the trauma of separation and the impact that that has long term. And so many of the things that we have planned with the Vision for Transformation are intended to bring a lot of this to life. And there are going to be things that we discover and ideas that you may have that we just ask you to be brave and come to the table with your thoughts and ideas and continue to show up every day and do the best work that you can do. And really just remember what has been shared here today, that our system is built to do exactly what it has been doing. And so we actually need to build a new way of being in order to have the impact that I believe that each and every one of us wants to have on children and families. So I just, again, extend my gratitude and thanks to the three speakers that have gifted us with their perspective, their knowledge, their wisdom, and their experiences. And to all of you, to Adam and your team, and to our tribal nations here in Oregon and across the country, and to our workforce, we can do this. We can absolutely do this and help foster the healing, the growth, and the development towards really having a system that is supporting communities, tribes, families, and children holistically, and repair much of the historical impact that we have had and build a new system. So that's my challenge to all of you, and just my gratitude to those who continue to share their wisdom and guidance as we work to do different and to continue to be better in our partnership with the communities that we serve. So thank you all. Adam, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. I appreciate your closing remarks and appreciate your partnership. You know, our tribal affairs team is growing and in numbers, and our partnership is also growing and strengthening. And so I look forward to working with all of our child welfare division and staff who are doing the tough work, the hard work in serving our tribal families and children. And so, you know, really appreciate you being here and providing us with that vision and sharing your vision for transformation. You know, I feel for us coming together on this issue, that's the only way it's going to work, right? If we do this as a collective. And so again, appreciate your partnership, Rebecca. Well, as we wrap up today's discussion, I want to thank all of our speakers, our Jocelyn, Dr. Cross, Sandy Whitehawk, for your presence, your insights, and your commitment to the work. You know, we owe you a debt of gratitude for blazing trails in where you are, both nationally, internationally, and within Indian country. You know, so really appreciate your time and your perspective with us today. I also want to shout out our agency, the Oregon Department of Human Services, for supporting this event and for giving us the space to be able to address this critical topic. Today is just only the beginning. It is only the beginning of our journey towards collective healing, of recognition as well as reconciliation of what has happened, and reconciliation also with those past actions, and how it is going to inform our future actions, so that we can best serve our tribal children and families and nations, and see them thrive. So again, I feel today is just the start. We wanted to at least get in front of um, all of you, and get in front of all of our staff, and bring awareness to what has happened, and also bring awareness of how do we come together to heal, and have a plan of action. Because I feel for today, I think it certainly has a lot of great reflections, but also some great thoughts about moving forward. So I feel like this is a positive step for today. Um, and I want to thank all of you also for joining us, and participating, those who are viewing our live stream, and also those who will be viewing the recording later on. Thank you so much again for your support, and for giving us your time to be able to listen, to be able to learn, to heal, um, and to be able to move with us on this topic. And finally, I want to thank our drum group, Four Directions, who's out of Portland, Oregon here, and they've blessed us with their energy and their traditional songs. And we are going to end today with Four Directions providing us with a memorial song, again, as we honor the tribal children, and those who have endured the hardship, right, of boarding schools, who did not make it home, but also those survivors who did, and are still healing. And so we want to provide that honor song as a way to close our event today. So yeah, thank you again. I'm Adam Vicente from our Tribal Affairs team at the Oregon Department of Human Services. And so I'm going to hand it over to Four Directions to close us out today. So thank you.
Yo,